Are you not confident on how to teach students to write the AQA A-level Biology essay? Well, coming up in today's episode, I'm going to share how to take your students through the AQA Biology essay with confidence. I'm going to be breaking down key strategies, what examiners are looking for, and why teaching your students to plan the essay is one of the top secrets to unlocking those all-important marks. Now, this is based on my own experience of teaching students the AQA Biology essay since the new specification in 2015, as well as training I've been on and from talking to examiners. So stick around for a quick win at the end as well to make your lesson planning even easier. Hey there teachers, welcome to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, the podcast where every week I dive into all the tips and tricks that make teaching life so much easier. Whether you're a veteran educator, an early career teacher learning the ropes, or balancing the classroom with being a busy parent, this will help you streamline your workload and bring a bit more balance to your life. You bring the coffee and I'll bring the teach and tell. Hello and welcome back to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, the podcast that helps you to teach smarter, not harder. I'm Katie Estruch and this is your go-to place for teaching tips, workload strategies and everything in between. Now before we dive into today's main content all about essays, let's have a quick coffee catch up. Okay, so this week I actually scripted this episode yesterday and I was like, I'm going to talk about how challenging I found my toddlers this week. Well, I say toddlers, I keep saying toddlers. They're not toddlers now, they're 4, they're infants. How hard I've found my infants this week. And it's ironic that I wrote that because I've just taken them to nursery after I've had an almighty tantrum from one of them. And that's what I was going to talk about this week for me. Well, the weekend, because they've actually just been on holiday with their dad. And I think that's possibly why they're a bit out of routine. But I've been in the absolute thick of managing some major tantrums and defiance. So yeah, twins, double the fun, double the chaos, and the tantrums have been coming thick and fast, as have the demands. It has felt a bit like an episode of Super Nanny some days, and I keep thinking, what would Super Nanny say? I'm like, come on Katie, you're a teacher, you know how to deal with this. But 4-year-olds are so much harder than teenagers. Oh my gosh. Anyone else out there got twins? If you have, please, I would love some advice on how you manage double the tantrums simultaneously and them just arguing with each other. Anyway, hopefully I've got new reward systems in place. It's going to be a game changer and I'll see them going back to their lovely, adorable selves. Okay, let's get into today's main topic, teaching the AQA A-level Biology essay. Now, this is a big one because it actually works out to just under 10% of a student's entire A-level grade. And because biology isn't a typical essay subject, teachers often don't have the experience of teaching essays, and sometimes the students aren't very confident because maybe they just take STEM subjects that don't require essays. So it is a big one that often teachers and students can find a bit intimidating. And that is also one of the reasons why I'm running a free CPD session on this. It's actually tomorrow, the 4th of March. So if you do want to come, you're going to have to sign up quickly and hopefully you listen to this podcast episode the day it came out. If you didn't, just to let you know, all of the free CPD sessions that I run, I leave the recording on my YouTube channel. So even if you've missed it, you can go and watch it on my YouTube channel as well. So the AQA Biology essay then. The whole point of this essay is that the exam boards have to make sure they assess a certain breadth of the specification. And they were given the options of, you can either do this by having a multiple choice section that would cover a whole range of topics, or you can have an essay. So AQA, even before the spec change, they had an essay, they stuck to an essay. And I know that some schools, teachers might pick to do other exam boards because of the essay, but my personal opinion is I love the essay, and I actually find that students that find the math skills, the critical analysis, and even to an extent the application questions really challenging can excel and boost their mark with the essay if they've been taught it correctly and they've done enough practice. And I have seen the essay mark for my students completely swing their grade. So I've seen that in the rest of paper 3, they got maybe like 10 to 15 marks. And then on the essay itself, they got between 15 and 20, one of the students, and that was enough to bump them up a grade. So if you can have confidence in delivering this essay and also relay that message to your students that the essay is not something to be afraid of, it is something that you can actually think, if I've revised, I can do well at the essay. There's not going to be any hidden bits that are really tricky to understand, any maths questions or anything to trip you up. It is just, have I revised and do I know the formula of how to answer these essays? And that's where we come in as teachers, how to deliver these lessons to them to make sure that they are fully confident on how to write the essay, what sorts of things to include and common mistakes to avoid. And that's exactly what I'm going to go through with you today. So the essays, you always get a choice of 2 titles and they always focus on a big theme. And all of the titles from the new spec have had the importance of something. So for example, there was the importance of nitrogen containing substances in biological systems in 2017. And the essay isn't just writing everything you know about nitrogen containing substances for this instance, or whatever the theme is. It is a split of the 2 assessment objectives, AO1 and AO2. AO1 is testing the students' knowledge, so what they know about a topic. So for the nitrogen containing substances example, if they picked DNA as a nitrogen containing substance, then part of it would be the AO1, what do they know about the structure of DNA? The AO2 is testing their application. So this is now where they have to apply their knowledge of that particular nitrogen containing substance and say why that molecule is important. So I do always say to students, because it's very clear in the specification and in the mark schemes that the essay is testing your AO1 and your AO2, that means they want to know your knowledge and the application. And the application is always saying, why is that important? So that takes us on to how to plan the essay. To get full marks, students need a minimum of 4 relevant topics from different subsections on the specification. Now, AQA do actually recommend that students write 5 topics, and the reason for that is they need a minimum of 4 relevant ones. So if they do actually just write 4, but 1 is irrelevant, they now only have 3 relevant topics, and that can instantly lose them 5 marks. So that's why they say write 5, because if 1 is irrelevant, then at least you still have 4 relevant topics. So I always say to students, that's our start point for planning the essay. We need to bullet point 5 relevant topics that are from different subsections of the specification. Now, the subsections bit is much easier for a teacher because we are far more familiar with the specification because we teach this every single year. So what I would encourage students to do is have an electronic version or a paper copy of their specification. When they're starting to plan essays, have that in front of them. So first of all, they can flick through to get ideas of what they could include, but also they can get familiar with what is a different subsection on the spec, because that costs quite a lot of students' marks, particularly in 2017 when there was the importance of diffusion. Some students wrote about gas exchange in fish, gas exchange in insects, gas exchange in humans, and that was all one topic, but they thought they'd done 3 separate paragraphs, but that's actually all within the gas exchange section of the specification. So it is important to make sure that they are aware of those subsections as well. So that's step 1. We come up with 4 to 5 relevant topics. And when I'm first delivering my essay lessons, I tend to spend almost an entire lesson just breaking down the mark scheme and explaining that to them. I'm not actually going to be doing that in this podcast, but if you are interested, I am doing that in the CPD session. So come along to that tomorrow or watch the catch up on my YouTube channel. But I break down the mark scheme to show exactly what each box on that mark scheme requires. Then we spend a little bit of time coming up with 4 to 5 relevant topics for a particular essay title that I provide them. And that takes up pretty much the entire first lesson, because really getting your head around the essay, what's expected of you, and then coming up with 4 or 5 topics each and then just discussing it as a class, that's about an hour gone. So once they've done that, the next lesson then is carrying on with this plan in a bit more detail, or you could set that as homework. So once you've got your 4 to 5 topics, then what I get them to do is start to think about A-level terminology, because this came out in the examiner's feedback that one of the big reasons that students aren't getting over 15 out of 25 marks is their A-level terminology and depth of explanations. So we need to try and encourage in the lessons to avoid any GCSE language. You need to have A-level key terms. So think about what words have you only learned at which words have you only learned at A-level, and are you explaining things thoroughly? So really encouraging them to explain in depth. So for example, not just saying we we need oxygen for respiration, and if we don't respire, then animals and plants die. You knew that at GCSE, you haven't explained in any level of detail. For A-level, we'd need to be saying you need oxygen for aerobic respiration because it is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain of oxidative phosphorylation. This is when we get maximum amounts of ATP being produced, and ATP is needed for metabolic processes for organisms to survive. So that's the difference, and I often show that as a comparison so they can see GCSE standard with no level of depth of explanation versus A-level standard. You've got all your key terms and you've got in-depth explanations. Once we've thought about that, we also need to consider for each of the paragraphs that they're going to write about, what is their AO2 going to be? So how are you going to link that to the theme of the question, which means explain why it's important. So if you were going to be talking about the nitrogen-containing substances topic, for example, and they might have done a paragraph on proteins, so they might have talked all about the protein structure. So you've got your primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary structure. Maybe they then link that to either hemoglobin or maybe enzymes. Either or, I just stick to one. They would then need to have the second part of that paragraph explaining the importance of hemoglobin, if that's what they picked, or explaining the importance of enzymes, if that's what they picked. And again, that would need to be at A-level standard. So the hemoglobin, they'd need to be linking that to oxygen dissociation curves and oxygen for aerobic respiration, and then like the example I said a few minutes ago. If they're going for enzymes, I'd then link it to the induced fit model and explaining how that lowers the activation energy. So once they've got that essay planned, and I actually typically spend an entire lesson, the second lesson, planning the essay so that they get used to really going through in detail their AO1, their AO2, and to plan that for 5 topics for the first time ever doing an essay, it does take a long time. And I get them to do it in pairs. I let them use books at this stage as well. Now, in the actual exam, I do point out to them that I would only spend 2 to 5 minutes doing the plan. And my extent of the plan in the exam would be listing the 4 to 5 key topics I'm going to write about and what my importance would be for each one. So that would be my plan. AQA recommends that they spend 40 to 45 minutes on the essay. And if they're spending longer than that on the essay, they are going to be lacking time to do the rest of the questions, and therefore they probably won't get as high a mark because they haven't got enough time to do the questions. So 40 to 45 minutes to write the essay. I say 40 minutes and then 2 to 5 minutes to do the plan. So that is approximately 8 to 10 minutes per paragraph. And I do break it down that much for them so they start to get an idea of how long they should be writing for. And that helps them when they're then doing it independently. And also it takes me on to the next lesson when we then start to write paragraphs. So I would then say, from the plan we had last week, we are now going to write one of those in exam conditions. And I do jump straight to exam conditions for that paragraph because they've already spent an entire lesson with their books planning it. So they don't need to have their books now because they've got that in their plan and they can use the plan. So I set a 10-minute timer and get them to pick one of the paragraphs. They've now got 10 minutes to write that paragraph. And in doing this, it's their first experience of writing the AO1, AO2, and practicing having about half and half, maybe about 2/3 to 1/3 in terms of AO1 to AO2, and also the timing. Now, once they've done that, the next step is I get them to write the rest of the essay for homework, and then I mark the rest of that essay and give them feedback. And I then get that back to them so they can have a read through. And then our next essay lesson, I give them an essay that they are going to write in time conditions for the entire lesson. Now, because it is their first essay, what I do allow them to do is I give them the title for homework so that they can plan the essay at home. And then for the whole lesson, they are writing it. Now, my lessons at the school I was at were an hour long. So they've had about 55 minutes, which is longer than you should be spending in the exam. But because it's the first time they've ever written an entire essay, I allow them to have all of that time. They can also then have a look back at the first essay they did for homework and look at my feedback to see if there's anything they should be considering. And you can then build on from there and make it harder by not giving them the essay title homework. They get that straight away at the start of the lesson and then they only have 45 minutes. But it's about scaffolding and building it up so it's not overwhelming, intimidating, and they can realise step by step it is actually manageable and they are improving and they are feeling more confident. Now, linked to this, there's actually one part I do in the first lesson that I forgot to say. We actually have a bank of essays that every year we pay to get some of our students' scripts back. So we always always ask the students' permission, obviously. All of our year 13s, we ask them before they go, are you happy for us to use your essay for teaching purposes for next year's year 13? And then they have to fill in a form, which you can get from your exams officer as permission. And then what we do is when the exam results come out, we look at the marks the students got and we pick maybe 2 of the top ones, 2 of the middle, and 2 of the lower scoring ones. And we do that every year and just take that from the biology budget, because that is such a valuable teaching resource for the teachers to see how those students did and what mark they got, but also for the students, because what we then do is give them, here's the title of the essay. You read through the essays with the mark scheme and you now tell me what grade, or not grade, but what mark do you think they would have got out of 25 and why? And because these were from the actual exams, we know exactly what mark those got. So that is a brilliant resource. If you haven't been doing that, then I really highly recommend you do that, because although AQA do provide some exemplars, there aren't very many. And I personally find it more helpful for me as a teacher to see how did my students actually do in the exam as well. Okay, let's move on to some common pitfalls and mistakes that it is essential you are explicitly telling your students. Number 1 is the essay does not need an introduction or a conclusion. There are no marks for these and examiners don't need to read them. They might choose to, but they don't need to read them because there are no marks awarded for them. So it is a massive waste of students' time. And it might feel unnatural, especially if they do an essay subject, but please encourage them. Don't do an introduction, don't do a conclusion. There are no marks for them, so it is literally a waste of your time. Number 2 is this misinterpretation of the mark scheme. So on the mark scheme, it literally says, with clear response shows a holistic approach to the question with a fully integrated answer, which makes clear links between several different topics and the theme of the question. Now, it's that bit there where it says it's integrated and links between several topics and the theme of the question, which is so misunderstood. This does not mean that each paragraph you have to find a link to the next paragraph. What it means is every paragraph has to link back to the title, which is the importance of. So every paragraph, they need to have their section of AO2 where they're explaining why that is important. Now, that is really, really commonly mistaught, and AQA have even published clarifying material on this to say, doesn't mean that, it means link it to the theme of the question. I even emailed them because I say this so many times on my Instagram and YouTube channel, and people say to me, oh, but that's not what my teacher said. And obviously you're going to believe your teacher over someone on YouTube. So I then wrote to AQA and got them to put it in writing for me so I can actually put that on my Instagram as well and say, this is from AQA, or I encourage them to get their teachers to ask AQA if they don't believe me. But the reason is the wording in that mark scheme is what Ofqual approved back in 2015 when the exam specifications changed. AQA are not allowed to now change that wording. So they realise it is confusing, it's caused confusion, but they're not allowed to change the wording. So instead they published that additional guidance for understanding the mark scheme, but I don't think everyone has seen that. And in fact, I'll just show you the additional guidance here. They have a section where they tell you, what do we mean by holistic? What do we mean by fully integrated? What do we mean by comprehensive biology? What do we mean by significant errors? And so on. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. I would also print that and the mark scheme for my students, because I do provide them with that as well in that first lesson when I'm explaining it. So that's the second big mistake, linking to the paragraphs rather than the theme of the question. And doing that doesn't lose the students any marks, but it makes it so much harder for them to come up with relevant topics if they're trying to think what links from paragraph to paragraph. Number 3, this is a big one that AQA were talking about this year, is they are seeing that essays are getting longer and longer, and that doesn't mean more marks. Some students are writing 8 to 10 pages, and they said the average length is now getting closer to 5 or 6 pages instead of what it used to be around 4 pages. And they've said that they haven't seen necessarily an increase in marks. There's been a slight increase, but the longer essays are not getting more marks necessarily, because often students are just writing everything they know about a topic, which actually means they're becoming irrelevant because they're not linking it specifically to the theme of the question, and therefore they are overwriting, which means they are becoming irrelevant, and also it's going to take them far more time. And that was the big thing that AQA were bringing up. They're worried that if students are writing essays that are about 6 to 10 pages, that they must be spending more than 45 minutes on them, and if they're doing that, then they're not leaving themselves enough time to do the rest of the exam, and therefore it's costing them marks. So do emphasize to students that a page per topic is plenty. You might not even write an entire page per topic, and that is fine. It obviously depends on handwriting size. The next one kind of links to this, where I was talking about being irrelevant. If a student is writing an irrelevant topic, that could mean that they've just written something that doesn't link to the theme of the question. So for example, there was one about energy transfers once, and some students wrote about nitrogen cycle, which is a nutrient cycle, not an energy transfer. So that was irrelevant. But you can also be irrelevant if you're just writing everything about a particular process, even if it's not relevant. So let's say there was a bit that you wanted to talk about the role of ATP in the Calvin cycle. There was a title on ATP a couple of years ago. But if you wrote all of the light-dependent reactions and then all of the light-independent reactions and didn't focus on what ATP's role was and why ATP was important, then you've actually become irrelevant because you've just written everything about photosynthesis but not linked it to the theme of the question. So that's another pitfall to point out to the students. Now, there are a couple of other little things before I get onto the last major one. So things like, again, emphasising that students are writing in A-level detail, not using GCSE key terms all the time, using A-level ones. And if they can have time to check through the essay, then ideal, but they might not. But the last big one, which I realise I haven't talked about yet, is the beyond the specification marks. To get 24 or 25 on the essay, you have to have a section beyond the specification. Now, I say to my students, unless you've been getting A's and A stars consistently, I wouldn't even bother trying, because I think it was 0.05%, maybe 0.04% this year got 25 marks. That is such a low percentage because it is so hard to do. Because to get those marks, you have to have written a perfect essay. So everything we've talked about has to be spot on perfect. And then on top of that, for 24 marks, either you've got an AO1 or an AO2 section beyond the spec. For 25 marks, you need both an AO1 and an AO2 section beyond the specification. And what you've written beyond the specification has to be at least A-level standard, and it has to be correct. So to do that, it is incredibly hard, and you're going to be spending so much time learning information beyond the spec for potentially 2 marks. If you actually invested that time in practicing exam questions and doing other revision for what is on the spec, you're going to get those 2 marks elsewhere. So in terms of using their time, it's far more valuable for me, I think, that they just focus on getting 23 as the maximum writing a perfect essay, unless there's someone that is really able and you are confident that they will be able to manage doing that extra reading as well as everything else without it being detrimental to their grade. So that is a brief overview. I know that wasn't brief, so I've been talking now for 26 minutes on my time. It'll probably be edited down a little bit, but there is so much to consider about these essays still, which is why if you do want even more help, my resource roundup for the week is sign up for my free CPD session, which is the 4th of March. It's at 4 p.m. It does get recorded, so even if you can't come live, sign up, because then you will get all of the resources that I use for free and you get access to the recording. And if you are watching this after the 4th of March, you still get access to the recording. It's on my YouTube channel, so you can head over there to take part. And yes, a lot of it will be covering some things I've said in this session, but we'll go into them in more detail, and you've got the chance to ask me questions. So that is my freebie resource roundup of the week. My quick win of the week is, if you are really looking to save time, streamline your essay lessons, maybe you're teaching this for the first time or you're not as confident in delivering these essay lessons, then I do have my A-level essay bundle. This bundle of mine has 5 lessons, so 5 PowerPoint lessons with guidance on how I would teach this as a series of lessons to my students. This has proven to be a really popular resource of mine because, as I said, it's a bundle of everything you would need in terms of lesson plans and the PowerPoints to deliver these lessons. So it's a fantastic resource to help keep your lessons running smoothly. It's what I use with my students, and as I said, I've been teaching this since 2015 when the spec changed, and it's based on thorough training that I've done with AQA and from examiner feedback. It is not AQA endorsed though, so just bear that in mind. It is just from my experience. It is not affiliated or endorsed by AQA at all. But if you are interested in that, it is linked in the description below. So that is it for today, teaching the AQA Biology A-level essay. And I really hope it's giving you some confidence, some ideas, and maybe made you aware of some of the common pitfalls that you hadn't realized. So if you did enjoy this episode, I'd really find it helpful if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts, because it helps boost the podcast so that even more teachers just like you can find it to help them work smarter and not necessarily harder. pleasure. But that is it for today. I'll see you next time, where I'll be talking you through how to teach critical analysis. You bring the coffee and I'll bring the teach and tell.